Welcome to this special KMUW and Kansas Leadership Center event collaboration, One Small Step, Courageous Political Conversations. We've seen so much division in our country lately, but there are many people working to heal these divides across political aisles, ideologies, and worldviews. Among them is the national radio program StoryCorps with their One Small Step initiative. Wichita was chosen as one of only 6 communities to participate in the program this year. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo, Director of Community Engagement at KMUW, and I've been honored to facilitate these one-on-one conversations using the One Small Step model. During the next hour, we're going to hear excerpts from 3 of these conversations, catch up with some conversation partners, visit with StoryCorps founder Dave Isay, and learn what we can do to build bridges of understanding among new people we encounter or those we interact with every day. I'm joined tonight by Chris Green, Managing Editor of Kansas Leadership Center's journal publication. Chris, how are you?
Yeah, Sarah Jane, thank you. I'm doing well. I have to admit, though, I'm still kind of trying to catch my breath a bit from everything that's going on, from the pandemic to the election. And I just think tonight's topic is just so timely because we've just been through this very polarizing presidential election cycle that's really kind of made our divisions, clear again. And I, as someone who reads a lot, I, read journalists and pundits talking a lot about how there's a lot of concern about our democracy, our republic reaching a breaking point that is really kind of scary and kind of, a little bit unthinkable. At the Kansas Leadership Center, if you're not familiar with us, we offer leadership training programs to help thousands of Kansans improve their organizations and communities. And we know that civic dialogue, healthy civic dialogue is really important. And that's one of the reasons why we publish the journal, which, as you mentioned, is the publication that I'm in charge of as the managing editor. And what we do is we write about key civic issues and encourage discussion about tough topics, whether it's guns and public safety or immigration or the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. We're trying to provide really good factual information and facilitate discussion through our coverage of those things. But tonight I'm excited because I feel like we're going to hear from people who really embody this KLC leadership idea of anyone can lead at any time by demonstrating a willingness to get outside of their comfort zone and have conversations with people who have very different beliefs and very different sets of experiences than they do. And it's also going to be cool. I'm excited to hear about One Small Steps, more about it, Wichita being like a proving ground for it. And, just a little bit more about it feels kind of empowering to hear that talking to the other side, it really does work. It really can make a difference, which if you spend all of your time on social media and such, that it may not always feel that way. And I'm really excited for those of you who are Engage ICT regulars. You'll get a chance to have a Kansas Leadership Center conversation. If you're on the Zoom part of this call, the last, between 6 and 6:30, you'll get a chance to actually talk about these issues and talk about the things that we discuss through this hour presentation. Yeah, I'm interested in hearing more about these folks who signed up for One Small Step and what they had to say. Do you have more to tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, this whole evening is a really exciting collaboration, and it does make you feel hopeful, I think. And these are difficult times, but as we'll all hear in this first audio clip from One Small Step participant Alejo, there is reason to be hopeful too.
I keep hearing that the United States is super divided, and I hear that everything is polarized and, you're left or you're right, you're one thing or the other, right? I think I have a lot more hope for humanity and for people in the United States than we're making it out to be right now in the media and in current culture. I just wanted to put myself out there and have additional dialogue with other individuals who I might not necessarily agree with and who probably had a different upbringing than I did. I like to think that we all want the same thing. We just have different ideas about how we get there.
So I appreciate what Aleo has to say about these conversations being hopeful. But from the ones that I've heard, like the other thing that is cool is that even though like they're hopeful, like it doesn't mean you're not talking about difficult things. And I think we're going to hear from Liz and Alyssa that they show that it's possible to talk productively about matters like that are as fundamental to someone, like not just their politics, but their identity as well.
Do you have friends in the LGBTQ community who are frustrated by the fact that you're a Christian? And do you have Christian friends that are frustrated by the fact that you're gay?
Most of the LGBTQ people I know in town go to my church. So I feel like I've had it more from the other angle of, people that, maybe don't understand how one can be a Christian and be gay. And there is also another group of people that believe that people can be same-sex attracted but be celibate.
It's hard because I'm like, I never ask strangers such personal questions.
I know. It's okay.
Okay, good.
So what about you? Do you ever feel misunderstood by people with different beliefs or troubled by people with the same beliefs?
Both of those all the time. I feel like, and Liz, like, feel free to tell me what you really think about this. But, like, to be honest, I hold the belief that homosexuality would be a sin. And sort of that third camp that you described would be where I find myself. But the thing that I feel like most misunderstood by when it comes to that is that I really love my gay friends, but I also, like, can't deny my conscience. It's not the most central part of my faith by any means, but it's like my conscience won't let me give that up, if that makes sense. But it really doesn't mean that I think poorly of gay people or my gay friends. It's not the thing that I think about when I'm like talking to you, Liz. I'm not like thinking bad things about you or feeling like I'm rejecting you as a person or something. It's something that's like for me in my life. But I also all the time feel troubled by people with the same beliefs as me because, here's an example. Donald Trump, I hate that guy. I struggle so much. Anytime I hear him talk, I feel very troubled by the things that he says. I could probably only name like 2 things that I agree with him on, but it's like I am pro-life and, things like that. But I feel all the time like conservative people are very mean and judgmental and very like tribalistic in a way that's like really, really unhelpful.
It's complicated.
It is. It really is.
So we had these individuals who talked about really complicated things and things that they really differed on sometimes and found either common ground or just common humanity under the surface. And I found that, these conversations were all pretty profound in different ways. And one of the things that emerges when you listen to these conversations is that they truly understand, in order to truly understand where someone's coming from, it helps to understand the road that they've traveled to get to their beliefs. And that's something that the conversation with Jennifer and Elise demonstrates.
It sounded like you were saying you lean more towards less of money being controlled by the government. Do you consider that part of being conservative?
When I started working in nonprofit, it was actually during college. I was working with kids in low-income schools and working with their families and doing basically like case management. And I was meeting these mostly women, mostly women of color who were, 20, early 20s, had a kid in elementary school, and their mom was, 15 to 18 years older than them. And so there were, 3 generations all living together, struggling, and they were talking about their benefits from the government as though it was a paycheck and their only form of income. And it just felt like the government had done them so wrong. I don't like where we've gotten as a country from the time of the New Deal of how many government programs are in place that are used by our citizens and can be abused by our citizens. And I was really upset by that, and I felt still am. So anyway, in that time in my life, I was looking around, I was like, well, I guess that makes me a conservative. When it comes to social issues, I tend to be more, I think, libertarian than Republican, like same kind of idea, government, stay out of people's lives.
I did like that what you shared with me took an issue that I have an opinion about, and you helped me understand how you got there, which that's really helpful to me because I can understand why you saw things that way.
Well, I love that you asked that question. That was going to be exactly one of my follow-up questions for you, is what you mean when you describe yourself as liberal or progressive.
A lot of what I believe is all about personal freedom and expression. So I think so many of us, our lives are difficult because we're kind of forced into boxes and labels, and that we can live lives that are not just better for ourselves, but for everyone else, society as a whole, if we can, embrace who we actually are. So instead of being told that you have to be this kind of man, this kind of woman, well, maybe you can be androgynous, maybe you can be pansexual, whatever it is, as long as it's not hurting people. And I think when things are repressed or like confined from being expressed, they make their way out. And I think the more repressed they are, the uglier it comes out. Because, everything comes out in some way.
No doubt about it. Everything in my life confirms that everything you just said is true.
Really?
Oh, sure.
So at KLC, we have this concept called getting on the balcony, where we sort of try to like remove ourselves from the situation and sort of think about what happened and talk about it and discuss it. And so Jennifer, Alejo, Liz, and Alyssa all agreed to get on the balcony with us in a way and talk about their conversations and talk about their experiences. And so for the next 20 minutes, we're going to hear from them. And I think like one thing to look for as you hear what their experiences were like is to really get a sense of just how impactful it was to just spend this like relatively short period of time talking with a stranger with different political beliefs. I was really struck by it and how meaningful it was to them.
We are here with just a few of the participants of One Small Step in the Wichita area. Liz, Alyssa, Alejo, and Jennifer, thank you so much for chatting with us. Liz and Alyssa, since the two of you were actually in a conversation with each other, why don't you start and tell us about your One Small Step experience and what surprised you the most?
My name is Liz Wine. I live in the Wichita area. I'm a social worker, and I got to chat with Alyssa, which was really great. And I think the thing that just surprised me most was just how I felt like safe talking to her, and also just felt like she was just a kind and compassionate person, and that we could have a conversation, and that it wasn't scary or anything.
Yeah. I also had a great experience. I enjoyed talking to Liz. Felt like the time flew by. Like I kept feeling like we had so many things that we could have talked about that we didn't even get to scratch the surface of. But yeah, it was a great experience. And I guess what surprised me most was how much I enjoyed it, and it didn't feel like scary or combative, and it was good.
What were the points of like differences that came up between you two, and what were the points of like agreement or alignment that you saw emerging?
Well, I think I'll kind of just start by saying it to get it kind of out in the open is I'm a gay Christian, a lesbian Christian. And so I think that, in Kansas, that can be kind of I don't want to say contentious topic, but it can be a topic where people have differing views. So I think we talked about that, but I think we had some, I think similar views on, I think just welcoming people and, accepting people for who they are.
I feel like I had a dozen more questions I could ask about her experience, but I don't necessarily feel like it's unresolved, if that makes sense. One of the reasons I was excited to participate in this is because I always want there to be open dialogue between people who disagree, because I think it's unhelpful for that to always be closed off for conversation. So I really appreciated getting to talk about it. And I think leading up to the election, it was just another good reminder of all of these people who are voting are people, like they're all individuals, and you can't lump everybody into one group and say they're all this way or they're all this way. And honestly, I had a really hard time this election because I didn't like, at least for president, I didn't like either of my choices very much. So it's, I don't know, it was like refreshing to talk to somebody to hear that they also feel like, you know, they have that same conflict, even where we agree in some places and we disagree in some, but they also have that same conflict of not liking every single thing about a particular candidate.
So Alejo and Jennifer, like you weren't in the same conversation. So we're talking about two separate conversations. I'm wondering like when you hear Liz and Alyssa talk, like what do you hear that sounds like your conversation, and how are your conversations different?
I had a conversation with Elise, and I was the conservative and she was the liberal. I'm using air quotes for those listening. And I really resonate with a lot of what Alyssa and Liz are saying, insofar as it felt like the time went quickly. It felt like there was so much more we could have talked about. I think we really enjoyed speaking to each other and connected quickly. And I will say that we went on to meet up for coffee when it was still relatively safe to do so, and then have transitioned to keeping in touch by text and have plans to spend more time together when we can in a hopefully more COVID light environment next year. But I would say we've become friends, and that is a really cool externality of the experience.
I guess I was the liberal in mine. But I would, I think I have to echo what everyone has said previously in the sense of the time went by fairly quickly. I wish we had more time, because I feel like the conversations that we had, I felt like we agreed on a lot of things. And I guess I was expecting a lot more disagreeing, and maybe that's I guess that's the most surprising thing for me, was that me and somebody who I guess technically you would say have different opinions agreed on almost everything that we talked about, right? I don't know, that was really interesting to me. I expected a lot more conflict, and I guess I was pleasantly surprised that there wasn't. And I don't know if you all experienced that as well. And I guess I didn't know what to expect going into it, but I was really pleased that, we were able to have dialogue about issues that were important to each one of us respectively. And, both of us came away, I think, better off than we were prior to us connecting with each other.
I will say something that I found that Elise and I had so deeply in common was, and is, a really inherent curiosity and desire to learn anything and everything, and to learn about each other. And I consider myself a pretty good question asker, and Elise took me to school. She was so I don't know how to explain it. She was so thorough and deep and thoughtful in her question asking. And there were just so many times when I thought, man, I should be taking notes on how she's framing these questions, because in a world where I want to be a better listener than talker, and I think that's part of what One Small Step is about for me, she is teaching me so much about how to be a better listener.
From my end, one of the things that participating in this conversation forced me to do was to sit back and ask questions, and try to be more empathetic and understand the other side, and understand that we're not living in a zero-sum game, right? Like, just because somebody won doesn't mean another side lost. And oftentimes I feel like we as a country feel that just because another side, the other side, the blue side, the red side, whatever you want to call us, right, won, it means that we lost. And that isn't necessarily the case. And I don't know. I wish that more people would participate in this. I would make I don't want to assume anything about anyone who has participated, but I'm going to make the assumption that most everybody who's participated in these conversations is curious and genuinely wants to learn. And I wish more of the individuals that aren't necessarily as curious or open-minded from both sides would participate in an exercise like this, because it really is, I don't know, pretty eye-opening. And I think this is the type of conversations we need to continue to have with each other, and understand that, just because we might agree with somebody on an idea, or our thoughts change, or our opinions change about a topic, doesn't mean we were wrong before, or that, we're less smart about whatever it is. I mean, I think we're more worried about losing or being called dumb or incompetent than we are about, understanding that, together we can work together to make this place better.
I think that's a good point, Alejo, because part of, I think, what my conversation partner and I shared, and I would imagine most, if not all, people participating in One Small Step shared, is a shared objective of understanding each other and different sides of different issues better, versus the objective so many people have of being heard, sounding right, sounding smart, sounding informed in what is important to them. And so I agree, there's probably some, I don't remember the term for this, but basically self-selection bias for anyone who signs up to be part of One Small Step. But I still came away from that conversation and into this election season with a renewed hope that I heard somebody on NPR today call it the angry Twitter mob. Don't listen to the angry Twitter mob. That not everyone is like that. And in fact, most people are not like that. And that most people actually probably don't care. But then there are all these other people who do care and have a shared objective of learning more and doing what's best for their communities and their families and their country. And when we can find those shared objectives, I think that is such an important part of these conversations, and something that I think was part of why my conversation partner and I connected so quickly, because it was really easy to see we both had that shared objective of learning about each other and hearing from the other, and not there to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add that thinking about how this election was going and how it is going now, it's a helpful reminder that sometimes the loudest voices we hear on maybe the opposing side are pretty extreme, and that's not the majority of the people who would find themselves aligning on that side. And that's been really helpful to remember that, again, you can't lump everybody into one group and then assume that they're all way over here, because that's not reality.
So based on the experiences that you all had, what advice do you have for those who are interested in having conversations with people who believe differently than they do?
I would take Jennifer's approach and ask questions first. I feel like oftentimes we go into these conversations, and if people go into the conversations, myself included, hoping that we can convince the other side to follow and, believe the things that we believe in. But I think the first step is really asking questions and trying to make a conscious effort to understand where other individuals are coming from.
Would you say that the conscious effort to understand where other people are coming from is one small step?
Like that. That needs to be a sticker.
I'm in marketing.
Shows. Very nice.
I agree with what Alejo was saying, because with that conversation, because we we didn't form our own opinions overnight. It's taken many years. And so to just go in and say, I'm going to change somebody in, you know, an hour, it's just not, that's not what it's for. And we have to respect the other person's side of you. But I think even though it's Zoom, just, you know, looking them in the eye and seeing them as a person, not, oh, they are a such and such or a whatnot, but just seeing them as a person.
So you didn't go in to change their mind or change who they would vote for.
Yeah, I had bullet points of saying, okay, we're going to talk about this. You know.
Two things I would say for advice for people. One is to always ask, how did you come to that belief? At the risk of speaking for my conversation partner, she's expressed a few different times how significant it was for her to learn why I chose to become a conservative after being raised by a very liberal family, and the story or stories behind that. And that it really was a perspective she'd never heard and some things she'd never thought about. And so it was for me with her. So I think always asking how or why did you come to that belief is one of the most important questions we can ask in these conversations. And then I think the other thing is leaving all assumptions at the door. I'm close with many Republicans and conservatives, and I could not possibly, none of them fall in the same place on a scatter plot graph. They are where some may believe one thing about one issue, the next will believe the opposite. And so it goes with literally hundreds of issues or policy points or political perspectives. And so I have learned to not make any assumptions about those friends and just keep that spirit of curiosity alive and listen to what they believe and where they're coming from on that.
Yeah, my advice to somebody who's wanting to have a conversation like this is, I know a couple of you said this already, but be curious and don't be afraid to be curious. Because I think if you are genuinely wanting to know, like if you're genuinely curious and you have the other person's best interest at heart too, I think it's okay to ask questions. And if they don't want to answer it, they can say, I don't want to answer that. But I think sometimes that's a way that we can also like express that we care about people, is by being curious about them and their experiences.
So I kind of ask you to sort of like, you know, put the spotlight on each other and talk about each other. If you had to like turn that back on yourselves and ask, well, you know, well, what did you learn about yourself from that conversation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
So as I get older and just, you know, going through life more, I'm becoming more open, just talking about how my sexuality is part of who I am. And that I can have that hard conversation, you know, even with somebody I don't know and they're on Zoom, you know, I think it's good practice to be able to be comfortable in your own skin. That could be about any facet of your life, but also just, I think having the conversation reminded me that I'm a whole person also, like I've done lots of different parts of my life that make up who I am. And I think that just help me remember how I'm seeing other people too. You know, when you work with kids, there's a saying that like somebody's not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time. And so remembering that too, people aren't giving me a hard time on purpose. They are having a hard time and it's reflecting. So just kind of some self-awareness about that and just being mindful of how I interact with others and not shutting down if something gets hard. Because I felt like with conversation with Alyssa, I never felt like I wanted to shut down or anything. Because I'll do that sometimes. I'll just be like, nope, not having that conversation. So just finding more safe ways to have those difficult conversations, I think, is important for me.
I feel like I realized that some of my like beliefs and ideology, I would have said like, I don't know, I'm kind of in the middle. I'm not really on a side. And in talking to Liz, I was like, actually, I kind of am on a side. On some places, you know, like I would have said, no, I'm right in the middle. And then I was like, no, I'm really not. And I think I like to I like to walk the line and be right in the middle of everything. And I'm realizing that in some ways I am not right in the middle, and that's okay. And thinking through, I am in the middle a lot of the time, but not always. And I can recognize those areas in myself.
Our political system is set up to force anyone who wants to be politically active to make choices and predefined choices. And so if I am interested in being active with conservative policy positions, that basically means I'm in the Republican Party in Kansas. And so that comes with its own baggage, and that people apply to me or that I apply to myself, but that isn't always fair to say that, you have to be one or the other.
It has caused me to have different conversations with, like my best friend who happened to move to the Midwest after I moved to the Midwest as well, lives a couple hours away. And we've had conversations, and, I've learned from him. I grew up with this young man, and we are like super far on the spectrum, opposite politically. And it's really interesting because we had almost the same upbringing, but I just assumed he thought the same things that I thought. And so it's caused me to have different conversations with him, and not so much of, previously I would have been like, I would have been like, what? You're crazy. How did you get to this point? Right. But, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I mean, I would have been lost for how to have a conversation with him. And, following this, now I've been a lot more curious about trying to understand, how he got to the point of where he is today, and trying to understand why he believes and listens to the people he listens to and things of that nature. And even with colleagues who I assumed as well, I'd put them in a bucket of, they agree, they think the same way that I think or whatever. It's just allowed me to build better relationships and better understanding with, with my best friend, and with other colleagues who, I labeled us, I guess, and I shouldn't be doing that.
So now that you've heard from some of the participants, we'd like for you to understand also some of the thinking behind the creation of One Small Step, the process itself, and what the ultimate goals are for this project. And to do that, we have an interview with Dave Isay, the founder of StoryCorps, which has recorded and featured deep and meaningful conversations between friends and family for more than a decade now. But One Small Step is the first time StoryCorps has brought two strangers to the table. Here's my conversation with Dave. I'm here with StoryCorps founder Dave Isay to talk about healing ideological divides in our country through the aptly named StoryCorps project, One Small Step. Thank you so much for talking with me today, Dave.
Sarah Jane, it's great to be here. Hi.
So let's talk about origin stories.
Sure.
How did StoryCorps' One Small Step initiative come about?
So we have now had about 650,000 people across the country participate in StoryCorps, and we call that kind of the signature StoryCorps interview. And because of what happens in a StoryCorps booth, we're kind of collecting the wisdom of humanity. And One Small Step is an idea that started a little bit more than 4 years ago. It looks like StoryCorps, but under the hood, as you well know, because I know you've been deeply involved in One Small Step for quite a while now, under the hood, it's very different. One Small Step pairs strangers. We'd never put strangers together before for a 40-minute conversation. It's actually 50 minutes. A StoryCorps is a 40-minute conversation. One Small Step is a 50-minute conversation, not to talk about politics, but just to get to know someone who you would not otherwise have talked to, someone across the political divides, again, a stranger, to get to know them as a human being. And the problem that we're looking at is this kind of culture of contempt we have in our country. And, this is not about finding middle ground. Of course, arguing is fine. Disagreement is natural. This is about what happens when we start to dehumanize people who we disagree with and the dangers that can come out of that. And, you know, obviously, you know, it's gotten a lot worse since the idea started. Was kind of a twinkle in our eyes a bunch of years ago. You know, there have been recent polls out that show that, you know, we fear and hate our neighbors more than even our traditional international enemies, like, you know, the Russians. You know, it's completely bonkers what's going on in this country. And, you know, there's a multi-billion-dollar kind of hate, contempt industrial complex out there, media and social media, where people are incentivized to get us to hate each other. So this is a bit of a crazy moonshot kind of effort to combat that. And we're, you know, we're thrilled to be working in Wichita and to be working with you guys on this. We started with you and are now expanding into something even bigger together with you over the next year, and hoping that everyone in Wichita knows about One Small Step in this effort, and are trying to convince people that it's our patriotic duty to see the humanity in people with whom we may disagree, and everyone who wants to hopefully will participate and, you know, have the courage to do these conversations. And you've facilitated some of them, right?
Yes, I've done about 20.
Yeah,
just this. Yeah,
you did one
week.
today.
Yeah.
It's a while. I mean, I did my first. You know, StoryCorps. Our Hippocratic oath is that we do no harm through StoryCorps, and this is obviously like a pretty serious. You know, it's simple but serious what we're trying to do here. And we've literally been testing for years. We've done hundreds of interviews in 40 cities across the country because we wanted to make sure that we got this right. And I actually did my first One Small Step test interview 3 weeks ago. And it's, you know, it's really a beautiful thing to have. You know, life is kind of about being surprised, right? And having your heart open and learning new things and sitting with someone who I never, ever in a million years otherwise would have had a conversation with. And, you know, having this conversation was exhausting. I'm sure you've seen that. And really, you know, kind of remarkable. She sent me an email after we did the interview where she said, I felt heard, I felt understood, and I felt beautiful coming out of that. And, you know, that's all we can ask for. Once we say one small step, we mean, you know, this is just one very small step.
Was this someone that in a conversation with you, or were you facilitating this?
Oh no, I'm not qualified to facilitate. That's you guys are. I'm not at that pay grade. That's you guys. No, I was matched with a stranger, and I think she was in Seattle. And, you know, just as you know from every StoryCorps One Small Step conversation, we exchanged 1-paragraph bios just with our first names. That's all we knew. And then we read our bios to each other, and then we just launched in and talked about our lives. And I talked about One Small Step, and it was, you know, thrilling. You know, it was kind of thrilling. I mean, I think, have you found, you know, a lot of these, it's, obviously everybody has a different experience, but you know, it from the what, you know, people have they kind of all end the same, right? Where people are like, gosh, I kind of like you. You know, it's really been a privilege to work on this, and we're incredibly grateful to you and to the station for being such incredible partners, and to everyone who's on this call. You know, we're all like completely sick of doing Zoom calls.
But these are good ones. This is a good one right here.
Like, I hope this one is worthwhile. And I do, you know, I couldn't believe more deeply in this. And, you know, coming out of the election, I think it shows, you know, it shows that we, you know, all of us were on the right track all the way along. And I do, I think it speaks to the, you know, core values of KMUW and public broadcasting as well. You know, it's about listening and, you know, remembering that, you know, trying to see the best in others, and no one's the worst thing they've ever done, and never giving up on people. So
I'd like to know more about your understanding of contact theory.
Sure.
And I imagine that as the son of a psychiatrist, the sort of psychological fuel for this project resonated with you as you were sort of framing this idea. Yeah. How does contact theory work, and why does it work?
Sure. So One Small Step is built on probably the most studied theory in the history of psychology. called contact theory, which was developed by a guy named Gordon Allport in the 1950s. And contact theory basically says that this is obviously very different than what happens when you're interviewing your grandparent. And this is where when I say that the two kind of interviews look a little bit similar, but have nothing to do with each other in some ways, that's contact theory. So contact theory is, as you said, the fuel that drives One Small Step. And the theory is that two people coming face to face who are enemies under very specific circumstances, after having an interaction with that person, a personal, intimate interaction, the secret sauce is having kind of a visceral emotional experience with that person, that the hate can melt away and you can see that person in a new light. If you do it wrong, you can make things much worse. And again, this has been very studied, and there have been ways to that it has failed miserably. But what we've been studying over the last couple of years is how whether One Small Step can create the conditions for contact theory, and indeed it does. You did your homework. I am the son of a psychiatrist and the grandson of psychiatrists and uncles and everybody else. But my dad was actually a psychoanalyst, so he would have not believed this theory. It wouldn't have been his thing. Wow. But contact theory is really the basis of this, and there's other theories as well. There's something called ripeness theory that, and I'm going to try to remember what it said. It says something like, this is, one of the interesting, fascinating things about working on One Small Step is getting to work with, the scientists and psychologists and people who study, intractable conflict. The kind of greatest minds in the country looking at this, who are kind of watching over our shoulder as we do this. And ripeness theory says that the only way that intractable, the kind of conflict that we're seeing, unfortunately, in the US right now, conflict that seems like there's no way out, that keeps building on itself. There are two conditions for getting out of intractable conflict. One is that both sides are miserable. And I think we're probably getting to that point in the country now. And the other is that there is a way out, that people see something that can get them out of this. And, in a small way, we hope that, One Small Step can meet the second part of that, the two conditions for ripeness theory.
So people have to want a way out, and there has to be a way out.
They have to be miserable enough. They have to be miserable enough.
So
that they are ready to find a way out.
Wow.
And then they have to see like a light at the end of the tunnel, a way that they can get out. So it's pretty miserable right now. So
and we've talked about, obviously, this being one small step.
Yeah.
What is the goal for these conversations? How do these small steps, what do they add up to?
Well, the big goal for One Small Step is that, and again, I can't, we had hundreds, thousands of cities to choose from across the country to begin scaling One Small Step. This is the beginning of One Small Step. We have been testing until now, and Wichita was through polling, and maybe we can share some of the polling data with you, and you can share it on the Zoom. And conversations and a lot of research, we decided that Wichita could be a city that could demonstrate to the rest of the country, this kind of courageous listening. The dream is that we convince the country it's our patriotic duty to see the humanity in people with whom we disagree. So that's the big dream. What we try and do in each individual interview is to see change. And, StoryCorps is, obviously very much of a heart organization, but there's a lot of science that goes behind it. We study everything we do. So when we were doing all this testing, we were looking to see what kind of impact One Small Step conversations had on people. And the kind of impact it had is, Sarah Jane, probably what you've seen. You said you facilitated 25 conversations. You've probably seen
20 so far. Mm-hmm.
20. You've probably seen 20 times. It makes people feel less hate towards the other, feel less suspicion, feel more hopeful about the country. And we also found that the kind of change that we see in people, we had hypothesized that this was the change we would see, but it tends to last quite a bit longer than we had hypothesized. So that's the micro change, and the macro change is that, you know, that we see a change in society. You know, that it's not a perfect analogy, but, you know, at one point, you know, smoking was cool and sexy, and then it wasn't. And right now, treating each other horribly is cool and sexy. And obviously, it gives you a little dopamine hit, going back to brain chemistry. And you know, the nastier you are on Twitter, the more likes you're going to get. You know, the more divisive you are on television, the bigger the audience you're going to get. You know, we hope that that this will, you know, someday make it maybe not quite as cool to be as cruel and vicious to others as we are right now.
So these conversations obviously aren't scripted, but they aren't totally unstructured either. Can you share a little bit more about how things unfold when participants come together to record?
Sure, you probably know better than I do. But yeah, no, they are not unstructured. It begins with, again, reading the bio of the person that you're talking to. So you're kind of walking in the footsteps of the stranger who you're talking to. And then together you pick questions. And we, as I said at the very beginning, you know, we don't suggest people talk about politics. If you do talk about politics, we suggest that you don't kind of come on head on. You know, this is not about arguing or winning an issue. So personal questions: who's been the kindest to you in your life? How do you want to be remembered? Questions about politics, which are more like, what is it that someone has said about, you know, your side of the divide that's hurtful to you, and what do you think they get wrong, and what have you gotten wrong about the other side? And then, of course, Sarah Jane, you're there to talk about some of the, you know, ground rules of these conversations. You know, no yelling, no talking over each other, no insulting. You know, and you know, I think part of the secret sauce of what happens in a One Small Step interview is that, like signature StoryCorps interviews, each of these goes to the Library of Congress. So everyone's aware that they're speaking to their, you know, to their great grandchildren. So they bring their best selves into these conversations, and I think that's partly why these go so well. And, you know, but going back to contact theory, one of those conditions of contact theory is that people have to feel like they're kind of the two people who are on opposite sides have to feel like they're kind of on a mission together, you know, and the mission is to have this conversation and really listen to each other. And that's, you know, again, that's part of what makes these work.
We talked a little bit about what comes out of these, where these small steps all go. And I don't know what you could share about results that you've seen so far, or how you measure the impact of this project, but I'd be curious if there's anything there yet.
Well, we're you know, we're really, you know, we started with you guys in Wichita, and we did some tens or dozens of conversations, and then hopefully we'll get to hundreds, and, you know, with a little bit luck, to thousands. So you need you need big numbers in order to see change. But we are doing polling now in Wichita to look at some of the questions that we've talked about. And I wish I had the polling in front of me, but oh, I have some of this. 50% of Democrats and Republicans in Wichita feel like it's hard for them to think of people from the opposite party as mostly good people. 61% feel the city is more divided than it has been in their lifetime. On the positive side, you know, 90% feel we can become better people by looking to the experience of others. So what we're going to be looking for is movement. I mean, it's again, it's feels a little bit cold in such a like a heart project as One Small Step, but we're going to be looking to see if, you know, feelings of contempt change in Wichita over a period. We'll be there for at least a year, over a period of time. How, if people feel like the city's less divided, if they feel more hopeful about the country. And then, of course, looking at the individual participants and seeing if this had a positive impact on them as well.
So I want to kind of go back to one of the things Dave talked about. And Sarah Jane, can I call him Dave now that we've like had him on a Zoom?
Yeah, no, you...
okay to call him the Garfield award winner, Dave. So you know, he mentioned contact theory as, you know, being one of the ideas behind One Small Step, and I think it's a really interesting topic because like it's really been rigorously studied, and I wanted to get a better understanding of it, like not just for like One Small Step, but like like how can any of us like incorporate this theory into our daily interactions to make our conversations across divide more productive. So I got the opportunity to talk to Dr. Linda Trop, who's a professor of social psychology in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And the thing you should know about her is she's kind of like one of the researchers. So I don't want to nerd out too much, but she knows a lot, and she had a team of researchers that went through hundreds of studies to kind of figure out that, yeah, social contact theory really does work across a variety of contexts. And so we'll just play a 10-minute clip of us talking about this theory. And one thing you should listen for in her comments is that a couple of people, Jennifer, Alejo, they brought up like, is this sort of like self-selecting when you do something like one small step? And I thought she had a really interesting answer about the impact that having a conversation like this can have, even if the people showing up are the people really inclined to want to have and be open to conversations with people who have different views.
Would you like to just introduce yourself real quick and tell me what your relationship is to contact theory, and maybe even a little bit about like, what is that?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, my name is Linda Trop. I'm a professor of social psychology at University of Massachusetts Amherst. I've been studying relations between groups for about 20 years. And a lot of what we focus on is intergroup contact. So what happens when members of different groups interact with each other? Do we tend to see, improved outcomes like reductions in prejudice, or do we see more detrimental outcomes like greater perceptions of threat or greater hatred and prejudice? And what we tend to see, we've done a type of research study called a meta-analysis, where you statistically pool together every single study you can find on contact between groups, and then you statistically pool the results. And when we did that type of analysis, what we basically find is that on average, greater contact between groups is associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And here we're talking about not just contact between racial and ethnic groups, but between many different types of groups, people with and without disabilities, people with and without mental illness, between younger people and the elderly. It seems to be kind of a general principle between people from different national groups that the more contact members of these different social groups have with each other, the less prejudice they tend to express toward each other.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's so fascinating that it works across so many different types of context. So when you do analysis like that, like, do you get any sense of like why that's the case? Like,
yeah, there's a few different ways that we can think about it. So on the one hand, we can think about the situations under which members of those different groups come into contact with each other. And so oftentimes we try to think about how, even if there are, inequalities and tensions in the broader society, what can we do when we bring members of different groups together to help their ability to get along and really get to know each other in a meaningful way? And so our field has come up with what are called optimal conditions for contact between groups, such as when you bring members of different groups together, you want to try to ensure equal status, that even if there are different status or power relations in the broader society, that when they're brought together, they are regarded and treated as equals. You also want to have what's called institutional support. That is, when members of different groups are interacting with each other, it's as if there are laws or norms or customs or authorities from social institutions saying, yes, you should interact with each other and you should do so as equals. And then there's also this idea of interdependence, that when members of different groups interact with each other, you really want to have situations where they have to work together and rely on each other to achieve their shared goals. That's really what's meant by interdependence, because otherwise they might just be coexisting, right? They might be like in next door neighborhoods to each other, but not necessarily interacting with each other. So you need to have those opportunities for members of different groups to really engage with each other and rely on each other in order to achieve shared goals.
I think I hear that a lot from people, that people want to have those sorts of experiences. But then I also go to Twitter and see the types of conversations that are going on there, or and don't know what's going on Parler these days, but so why is it difficult to create these conditions? Like, why doesn't this happen more often?
I think that's a great question. And I just have to point out, Twitter, well, let's at least hope that Twitter is not reality. That there is also something that other psychology research would show, that when we're interacting in spaces where we feel more anonymous, we're more likely to be extreme or outrageous or even mean-hearted in our behavior towards other people. So if we don't feel accountable, and I think Twitter is a great example of this, it's less intimate, it's more anonymous, we can kind of get away with saying things that we wouldn't necessarily say to a person in a face-to-face interaction. That it just kind of lends itself to leaning toward more snarky or extreme or, disruptive behavior. When you have a face-to-face interaction with a person, and I should say, especially given the pandemic right now, when I'm talking about face-to-face, I'm talking about, just like talking directly to somebody, whether that's actually an in-person interaction, or a lot of research has shown that we can experience somewhat similar things talking with people virtually in an online setting. But it's really that engagement, kind of taking the time to focus on what people from other groups are thinking and feeling, and sharing a little bit of yourself in return, right? So it's that type of kind of deeper engagement where you're kind of coming with a genuine interest in getting to know people who are different from you, as compared to what we might see witnessed on Twitter, where people are trying to have the good soundbite or the good comment that gets, shared in a viral context.
Well, why do you think that doesn't happen more often in our society? Like, it feels like everything I learned on Sesame Street. What are the forces that are pushing back against those things happening? And how do I, as an individual, start to create space for that?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think one of the challenges that we're facing in our society today is that we live in increasingly segregated communities, whether we're talking about racial segregation, ethnic segregation, economic segregation, or political segregation. Now, in some ways, that's understandable, right? Because we like to live near people who are like us, right? It feels more comfortable. We don't have to deal with those tensions around difference. But one of the pitfalls of that is we grow less accustomed to dealing with difference and navigating difference and knowing that we can handle difference.
I just sort of wonder, is this something that there's evidence that anybody can do this, and that even people who are really skeptical and distrustful of the other side can let their guard down enough to make these worthwhile?
I do think so. And here, I may be cautiously optimistic. As compared to coming from automatically a place of skepticism. But by saying that, I don't mean to say that it'll be easy. It's still going to be uncomfortable. A lot of the work that I do has to do with racial and ethnic relations, right? And a lot of white people and people of color feel very uncomfortable about having real exchanges with each other. And so what I try to remind people is, I think it is possible, but it's not always going to feel comfortable. You're not always going to be like, oh, this is fun. It might be some work. Because especially if we have very deeply forged allegiances to one side or the other, it's going to take some work to kind of open ourselves up, or say you know what, I'm just here to listen, I'm just here to learn. It might be a hard thing to do, but I think it's probably a worthwhile muscle to work at, and I often say, when we learn a new language, we don't expect to speak fluently. When we're learning a new sport, we don't know how to hold a tennis racket at first, we kind of learn it and we get better at it, and we screw up, and we should expect to screw up. But the more we do it, it's like working any muscle, the better we get at it and the more natural it feels.
Well, and that's what I think is what's kind of cool about One Small Step, is it's sort of like your ready-made CrossFit program for, trying this.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it. And so you have to kind of commit to the training, right? You're not going to enjoy every minute of it, but you might appreciate the outcomes. And I think, getting back to the research side of things, there is also research evidence to show that it's not only having direct exchanges with members of other groups that changes our attitudes and kind of changes our social climates. In fact, simply knowing other people in our social networks who have had close relationships or friendly interactions with members of the other group can independently improve our intergroup attitudes and kind of make for a more cooperative social climate. So, even if it were the case that it's only kind of preaching to the choir or having those people who are self-selected and already willing to bridge across group boundaries, even if that were the case that it's only those people who participate, we might still see broader effects of the exchanges that they have to the extent that they talk with their family members, their friends, and their neighbors about what they've experienced with members of other groups as well.
Well, so Wichita is actually going to be sort of like this place where One Small Step is devoting a lot of energy to having conversations. So maybe sometime in the not too distant future, you'll be looking at us to see what was produced in Wichita in relation to
excited. I'm excited. Please keep me posted. And I really just wish the best for everyone to have like really meaningful, authentic conversations with members of different groups, just to try it out and see how it goes, and to see if it changes how they feel about themselves or their own stances, as well as how they feel about people who might have different views or experiences or attitudes than them. I'm excited to see what y'all learn.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your insights about contact theory.
Absolutely, a pleasure. Take care.
That was a fascinating interview. That was really cool. So, I was listening to that and just thinking that what I've learned after facilitating these conversations is that almost everyone has things that they'll agree on with the person who's on the other side of the aisle. And finding those areas of harmony can be at least an eye-opener and at most a really profound experience of shared humanity.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that sounds right. And for me, like one of the things I'm taking away is that like there really is like a really good research and a roadmap for like improving our political divides. Like it's really kind of simple and straightforward. Talk to people who are different from you. But like the simplicity of that, it's also really hard to also do that. And you kind of have to take initiative. Like you have to be able to be willing to go out and do it, like Alejo and Jennifer and Alyssa and Liz have. And so, yeah, so if I want to do that, Sarah Jane, how do I do that? How do I do what they did?
Yeah, there are a couple of options because Wichita is now one of only 4 cities in which StoryCorps is anchoring One Small Step in 2021. So we'll be able to record and share and preserve conversations that show the whole country how Kansans can listen to each other in spite of their differences of opinion. So people can sign up to record for One Small Step with StoryCorps at takeonestep.org/Wichita. And that's the classic setup of being paired with a stranger and having a facilitated conversation. But you can also now, and this is also new, you can take One Small Step DIY style and do it on your own with someone that you do know. And so you can check out StoryCorps' One Small Step Do-It-Yourself conversation guide, and you can actually record a conversation there too that will be archived. And that's at storycorps.org/ oh, it's a lot of letters. Let's put it in the link, but it's SCC/OSSDIY. And lastly, before we go, I did want to mention that the Wichita Public Library is an ongoing partner in KMUW events, and they've provided a really great reading list pertaining to this topic that you'll want to check out as well. So it's in the Facebook discussion there, as well as the links, and at engageict.org. I'd like to thank everyone for being with us this evening. We truly appreciate your time. Thank you so much.